Hi everyone, welcome to the October 2022 Ask Me Anything session here at RentPrep. My name is Andrew Schultz. I'm the community manager here at RentPrep. I'm also a real estate broker in the state of New York with over 14 years of property management and investment property experience. What do we have going on today? Today is our AMA session. We're going to go through and answer a bunch of questions that we were able to pull from you, our viewers, as well as from our Facebook group. If you're not already signed into our Facebook group, you should definitely take the opportunity to check that out. I'm actually going to pull it up on screen here. It's going to be facebook.com/groups/rentprep, and we'll switch over to desktop view here so that you guys can take a look. I'm not currently logged into Facebook, so unfortunately you can't see anything. This is a private group, and we do double check everybody that comes in to verify them. So this is a 13,000 member group with basically only landlords in it. It's a great opportunity for you to get a question answered outside of the AMA sessions. If you're in a situation where you have a question and you're not sure how to handle something, this is an excellent place for you to start. It's a great resource and it's free. Go ahead and check that out today, facebook.com/groups/rentprep. Since we're on desktop, I'm going to go ahead and plug the podcast as well. If you didn't know, I'm also the host of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. You can see here we put out a new podcast episode about once every 2 weeks. I believe we're actually due for another episode to be coming out here in the very, very near future. And last but not least, if you haven't noticed yet, we are starting to do more video content as well. You can find our video content over on our YouTube page, youtube.com/rentprep. There's 2 videos that we published recently that I wanted to make sure to highlight here. The first one is going to be the flushable wipes video. We're going to go ahead and mute that, and then we'll skip this ad. I apologize. But this one basically goes through, and I do a breakdown of different types of wipes and whether or not they are flushable or not. And then the other video that I wanted to point out, this one gets asked to us all the time. Again, this one is muted, but we do have a video up now on, whoops, excuse me. We do have a video up now on how to select a payment app. So PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, and Cash App, I think were the 4 that we reviewed. This is a common question in our group. It pops up quite a bit. What payment app is the best? We go through and explain the differences between the payment apps, what app might work best for you, and things of that nature. So that's definitely a video that's worth checking out as well. We are going to jump into the questions here in just a moment. Before we do that, I wanted to go ahead and thank our behind the scenes crew today. I'm working with Ashley and our marketing team. She's going to be monitoring our Facebook live chat as this event is going on. And if there are questions or comments that come in, she'll feed them to me because I can't actually see that stuff while I'm live on video. All of that said, we're going to go ahead and jump into our questions here. If you didn't get a question in for the October session, we do run these on a monthly basis. You can find the information on these in our Facebook group. And you can go in, basically we create a form where you can submit a question either with your name or completely anonymously. And then we go through and answer a whole bunch of them once a month in these AMA sessions. You're going to see me taking a lot of sips of water today. Apologies in advance, but that's just the way it is. Anyway, we do have Ashley behind the scenes working with us today. And with all that said, we're going to go ahead and jump into our first question here. This one comes from Diane. Diane's a new landlord and she inherited 2 problem tenants. Both leases have expired prior to the sale of the property. One tenant in the lower unit was served a 30-day notice to vacate 30 days after purchasing the property as the apartment was filthy and in need of repairs. The other tenant is late on the first month's rent and they're already 2 weeks late on the second month's rent. Now the upper unit is starting to report bed bugs in the unit and saying that it's because the lower tenant had to move out. What are my responsibilities in Pennsylvania regarding bed bugs, and can I serve a notice to vacate after having just received such a complaint? So I don't know what the laws are in the state of Pennsylvania, but I can tell you that here in the state of New York, we do now have a law on the books. I think it was part of the 2019 HSTPA legislation that was passed here in New York State, but there is a law on the books now with regards to retaliation. And actually one of the things that they talk about is when a tenant makes a maintenance complaint and then you turn around and evict them, are you retaliating against that tenant because they submitted a maintenance request? And that's something that you might have to deal with when you get to a court scenario. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's something that you should use or a reason for you to not proceed with whatever it is that you're attempting to do. In this instance, go ahead and serve that notice and let the court sort it out if you get to that point. Now, let's go back to the issue at hand with the bed bugs. I also want to talk briefly about warranty of habitability. And here in the state of New York, generally speaking, if you wind up with some sort of a pest infestation, it is going to fall to the landlord, even if it's the tenant that brought the infestation in. Doesn't mean that you can't turn around and attempt to charge the tenant for the infestation after you've gone ahead and treated it, but more often than not, you're going to be the one who winds up handling the treatment side of things and then worrying about the billing side of things on the back end of that. As far as bed bugs moving from one unit to another, I don't know as though bed bugs crawl through walls and stuff like that. I suppose they could. I mean, it's a bug, it has legs. I don't know as though I've heard of it jumping from one unit to another. More commonly, what will happen is someone will sit on a piece of contaminated furniture or something like that. A bed bug will attach itself to their clothing. Before you know it, they've carried that bed bug home, and now they have bed bugs in their apartment. So since the downstairs tenant has moved out, the upstairs tenant is complaining of bed bugs, you might want to ask the upstairs tenant if they perhaps were in the lower apartment frequently, like visiting the lower tenant, or maybe they bought a piece of used furniture, some used clothing. It could be anything. If they bought something used, or even took something after the other tenant moved out and said, I can use this, we're not going to let this go in the garbage, they could have actually brought bed bugs in that way. So our lease does stipulate that tenants are responsible for the cost of infestation after 30 days once they've moved into an apartment. So if they're past the 30-day point, which obviously they are in this instance, we would say that the tenant's responsible for the cost of that infestation because we're not the ones that brought the bed bugs in. And I think that their claim that the lower tenant's bed bugs found their way into the upper unit, it's a little bit dubious unless there's some sort of a connection there that they can make. On to our next question. This one is an anonymous question. How do you handle a tenant who says that she'll be seeking legal advice for items clearly listed in the lease agreement? Is it better to just let her go after the lease is up? The things listed were the tenant is responsible for extermination as and when needed. We just talked about that. The other was the prevention of unit access to the landlord or his agent for repairs incurs a trip charge. She requested repairs but started asking for names of maintenance technicians, which we didn't have immediately to give to her. The process is that we have received and scheduled the repair requests. The warranty company sends repair technicians. Stop using a warranty company. And we coordinate and notify tenants of times technicians will be coming and ensure it is convenient for both properties. There's a lot going on here. First thing I'm going to say is don't use a warranty company. I've talked about warranty companies extensively in the past. I'm not going to jump into it in this video. But pretty much every warranty company that I've ever worked with is a complete and total pile of garbage. It's a disservice to you and to your tenants to have a warranty company. Find a local vendor that you can work with, know and trust. That's going to be the better move for you here. But yeah, oftentimes warranty companies, unless it's like an appliance warranty, like the appliance is under warranty from the manufacturer, we don't deal with like third-party warranty companies or anything like that because the time that it takes them to coordinate a repair is way longer than what it rightfully should be. Anyway, back to the question at hand here. How do you handle a tenant who says that she'll be seeking legal advice for items clearly listed in the lease agreement? Look, a tenant can take their lease to an attorney and have it reviewed anytime they want. If they want to spend that money to sit down with an attorney and have them review the lease, that's their prerogative. We give tenants the lease and we give them time to sign the lease prior to moving in, specifically so if they have questions, they can come back to us and ask them. We don't hand them a document and ask them to sign it right then and there in front of us. It's a 13-page document. Nobody's going to sit there and read our entire lease page by page right then and there. And we tell tenants, look, if you have concerns, talk to an attorney. I can't advise you on the language in the lease. You need to speak to an attorney. It's up to the tenant whether or not they feel the need to talk to an attorney before, during, or after their tenancy to review some aspect of their lease. And there's nothing you can do to stop them if they want to do that. Now, that said, 95% of the time when somebody says, I'm going to talk to my attorney, they're never going to talk to an attorney. They're using it as a scare tactic. My typical response when somebody says, I'm going to take this to my attorney is, okay, please have your attorney contact our office since let me rephrase that. Okay, since you've retained legal counsel, we are no longer authorized to speak to you on this matter. We have to speak to your attorney. Please have your attorney contact our office and we'll respond to them by giving them our attorney's information. 95% of the time, that's the end of the issue. The tenant finds a way to, suddenly my attorney doesn't want to look into this or whatever the case may be. It's amazing how quickly when somebody gets called to the floor for something like that, they will kind of back down unless they actually have an attorney. I mean, some tenants will go the length of getting an attorney and more power to them. But more likely than not, this tenant is just trying some scare tactics to see what they can do to kind of push things forward. Responsible for extermination as and when needed. Again, we just talked about that in the previous question, but this access prevention thing is more of a concern for me, where a tenant's just telling you, no, you can't come in. Every state, to the best of my knowledge, has some sort of notice term or notice period whereby you can post a notice on a tenant's door and walk into that unit. It's different in different states. Sometimes it's different depending on the circumstances, but there's always some mechanism by which you can force entry into that apartment. If a tenant's telling you, no, you can't come in, and you have to go to the length of putting notice on their door, at that point, look, you can contact the police department and tell them, I've posted notice on this tenant's door. I need to come in to do maintenance. The tenant is barring me from accessing the apartment. I need somebody to come out here and address the situation. What kind of a response are you going to get from the police department? I don't know. That's a good question. Realistically speaking, I think that they'll at least come out, and generally once the police show up, the tenant's probably going to back down and say, fine, do what you need to do, blah, 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 blah. It's obnoxious. It really is. And we have some tenants that prefer to be home for maintenance. They don't want people in their homes when someone's not home. And I can understand that. And we do make an attempt to accommodate that one time. And if the tenant is in a situation where they can't come up with a time that works for them and the vendor, all of our vendors are licensed and insured, and we're going to send that vendor in because we trust the vendor. We don't need somebody to be home to complete a maintenance job. And if a tenant wants to be home, that's their prerogative, but we're not going to bend our schedule to every single tenant for every single maintenance job, or we would never get any maintenance jobs done. You've got to figure that we're managing a large number of doors, and if we had to schedule every single appointment around the tenant's schedule, we would never get any of our maintenance actually accomplished. So there is a mechanism in pretty much every state law by which you can gain access to that unit, do the maintenance work that you need to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as for what to do when the lease is up, yeah, I probably would not be renewing this tenant. She's making your management situation a nightmare, and it doesn't need to be that way. So if you're in a state that allows you to terminate a tenancy at the end of a lease term, that would be my recommendation. It doesn't sound like there's a non-pay issue here or anything like that. It sounds like the tenant's just being obnoxious and trying to prevent you from getting anything done. So I would just not renew the lease at the end of the term and move on. On to our next question. This one is from Susan. The necessity of having an LLC for 2 small properties versus just having an umbrella policy. If one does get an LLC, how difficult will it be if I decide to sell a property? So I'm not an asset protection expert, but I do know a little bit about asset protection. So I'll give you a little bit of knowledge based on what I know, but realistically speaking, you're going to want to talk to somebody that really specializes in asset protection, either an attorney or an accountant or a team that does something like that. Those are the people that you really want to talk to when it comes to asset protection. Now, you're talking about an LLC versus just having an umbrella policy. Anytime you can separate yourself from a liability, I would take the opportunity to do that. So if you have the property and it's owned in your personal name, and for whatever reason you can't deed that property to an LLC with a quitclaim deed or something like that, maybe there's some sort of a due on sale clause in your mortgage that would prevent you from making that transfer from your personal name into an LLC. I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. More often than not, the bank doesn't care if you move it from your personal name to an LLC as long as they continue to get paid. Now, there are possibly some issues there with commingling of funds and blah, blah, blah. Talk to your accountant about that. But more often than not, a bank's not going to call a property due on sale if it's a quitclaim deed from you to an entity that you own. That said, you can definitely get by, at least as far as my knowledge base goes, with having a good liability policy on each property and having a good general liability umbrella for yourself personally or for your business or however your insurance agent recommends that you set it up. Basically, you're giving yourself 2 layers of protection. If you've got, say, 3 properties, you've got 3 umbrellas for your individuals, and then you'll have one overarching umbrella that's going to cover basically anything that would happen under those rental policies. Now, moving into the LLC, you can basically set this up in the exact same scenario where you would have, and actually this is probably how I would recommend setting it up, would be have, again, your 3 individual properties on each of the 3 properties, your 3 individual policies, on each of the 3 properties, and then the overarching liability umbrella for the LLC. And then you could additionally have protections for yourself personally outside of the LLC and things like that. I like LLCs for property investing for a multitude of reasons, tax through status and things of that nature. There are a lot of reasons that LLCs are nice. Different states do have different rules on how LLCs work, so you need to look into that a little bit. But I would definitely say that either way that you want to go, as long as you're taking the opportunity to protect yourself with some insurance policies, which obviously you are here, I think you're going to be okay. Realistically speaking, asset protection is one of those things that can really evolve into a monstrous situation of trusts and LLCs and different instruments that I don't even understand, and I'm not even going to pretend that I understand. You know, holding companies, operating companies, some stuff I understand, but when you start getting into the higher level trusts and things of that nature, you really need a good tax advisor, a good accountant, and a good attorney to make sure that you're protecting yourself and protecting your assets. Moving on to our next question. This one is from Ned. How a landlord can track when or if counties and cities introduce new ordinances which regulate how landlords manage their business with their tenants, rent increases, security deposits, end of lease, etc. I live in Washington State, King County. This used to be regulated by the state RCWs, but now it's chaos. I understand where you're coming from. When COVID first hit, there were several laws that passed in a quick succession here in the state of New York that altered the way that we did business. Legitimately, for the first probably month and a half to 2 months of COVID, I would literally have to watch the governor's daily press conference to know how I needed to run my business the next day. It was literally that crazy. So I can certainly understand where you're coming from when you're talking about not being able to keep up with all of the changes that are going on and things of that nature, because it's very, very difficult to do. As a matter of fact, I can remember having a conversation with Steve, the CEO at RentPrep, when all this was going on, when COVID was first starting to hit, and just telling him, I'm like, I could practically spend all of my time just tracking legislative changes inside my business and not even operating the business. And he understood too, because they're seeing it on their end with different restrictions in different states and in different municipalities with regards to what people can search for when they're looking for new tenants. So this is definitely an issue that's happening across the country. The best thing I can tell you as to how to track this stuff, stay alert on your state's legislative website, because if there's something that's going to pass at the state level, it's going to appear on the legislative website before it gets voted on. That's probably one of the best resources on a state level, is to check your state legislative website. I know at least here in New York, they publish the full text of the bill well before it actually gets voted on. So you have an opportunity to look at it and kind of really wrap your mind around it and things of that nature. The next thing I would recommend would be ensure that you're a member of a couple of different Facebook groups. I usually recommend being a member of a couple of different local landlord groups on Facebook or local investor groups on Facebook, because a lot of news about local issues gets shared in there. The next thing I would recommend would be find a good either state or national group. Obviously, I like the Rent Prep for Landlords group, big fan of that one. We do talk a fair amount about upcoming legislative changes and things like that pop up. And the nice thing is there's 13,000 members in that group. So chances are there's somebody in your state who's going to see something, and if they post it, then it's available for all of us to take a look at. There's also several different professional organizations, I guess you would call them, that you can join. I know at least here in the state of New York, there are a couple of different like apartment associations that you can join with the intent of basically helping landlords stay informed, helping landlords build better processes, things of that nature. And then as you start to grow, if you are starting to do more property management or things of that nature, there's always National Apartment Association and National Association of Residential Property Managers, NAA, and NARPM. And I'm a member of NARPM as well. Good organization. They produce a lot of content on legislative. They actually have a legislative affairs committee. So if you're starting to manage properties for outside people, or you have a large number of portfolios that you're managing, my recommendation would be possibly look into a NARPM membership. But yeah, definitely stay informed. I think that's one of the key things here is so many landlords think that this is just plug and play. Drop a tenant in an apartment, pick up a rent check. Drop a tenant in an apartment, pick up a rent check. It doesn't work that way anymore. In 2022, this job is like 50% caseworker and 50% housing provider. It's definitely a lot different than what it's been in years past, and I think that that's going to continue to change as time goes on. All right, on to our next question. This one is from John. Can you discuss the timeline of when a tenant does not pay? Example, with a 5-day grace period, at what point do you send a notice that the rent is late or past due? On the 6th, include the late fee. When would it be appropriate to send a quit a quit or cure for payment. So there's no state specified in this, and every state's laws are going to be different with regards to evictions. I'm going to say two things with regards to that, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what the law is here in New York State currently. The first thing I want to say is you should be using an attorney for evictions in 2022. I understand that you can white knuckle it, you can grin and bear it, you can get through the process on your own. But literally, I talked to a potential client 3 or 4 days ago, and I posted about this in the RentPrep group, that they've had to restart their eviction process 3 times now because they keep screwing up the paperwork. And they don't want to use an attorney because an attorney's going to cost too much and yada, yada, yada. And eventually what it boiled down to is I told them, look, I can't help you. I can't represent you in court because I'm not an attorney, which means that I would be hiring an attorney on your behalf, which I'm not going to do for free. So you're going to be paying more than what you would if you went to an attorney directly. And at the end of the day, the attorney's going to do a better job because they're going to get the eviction heard and they're going to get the eviction taken care of. Versus you, Mr. Client or potential client, who has been running the same stream of nonsense for the last 3 attempts, and now you're 6 months in and you still don't have your asset back. So that's my recommendation. If you're going to do an eviction in 2022, hire an attorney. My second piece of advice is hire the right attorney. Make sure that you're working with a landlord-tenant attorney. Make sure that it's someone who's familiar with the eviction process in your state and in your municipality, because different municipalities will sometimes have a little bit different regulations than what there is on a state level. We just talked about in the previous question, finding local Facebook groups where you can interact with other local landlords. This is a good reason to do that because you can hop on that local group and say, I need the best real estate, the best landlord-tenant attorney in Buffalo, New York. Who do you guys have? And you're going to get some responses. So that would be my recommendation. Hire an attorney, make sure they're a competent landlord-tenant attorney. Now, in terms of what's the timeline look like, here in the state of New York, we do have a 5-day grace period, which means on day 6, we are sending that tenant the certified letter that's required by New York State, letting them know that we have not received their rent payment for that month. The late fee, I believe, also goes into effect on day 6. We do have restrictions on what we can charge for late fees here in the great state of New York. That was passed as part of the HSTPA legislation back in 2019. Enough on that. But I will say that we do have the 5-day grace period. Then we have to send a certified letter. And again, check your state laws because there are certain, does this have to go certified or first class or is served in person? Can it be mailed and mailed? Whatever the case may be. Every state is different. So you really need to dig into this if you're going to attempt to do it yourself to figure out what exactly it is that you need to do. After the 5-day notice comes our 14-day notice, which is basically our written demand for payment of rent. And after the 5 and 14-day notices have elapsed, and here in the state of New York, they can run simultaneously. So we issue our 5-day on day 6 and our 14-day on day 7, and they run concurrently. So by the end of the 14-day period, we're now ready to send that file to our attorney. They're going to go ahead and send we're going to go ahead and send the file to our attorney. They're going to go ahead and actually file for the court hearing, the petition to recover the real property. And then they're going to go ahead and have that tenant served using their process server so the tenant knows when they need to appear in court. That's going to vary, again, on timeline depending on your state. I know here in Western New York, at least in the city of Buffalo, we're looking at between like 3 and 5 weeks for court dates right now. Different areas, it's going to be different lengths of time. Once you get to court, you may wind up finding out that the tenant doesn't show up and the court grants a deferral or something along those lines. That could extend your timeline out. In New York State, I believe the minimum amount of time for a deferral is 14 days. I could be wrong on that. And then again, once you actually get into court and have your day in court, there's going to be a period of time before the set out occurs, generally speaking, 14 to 30 days, depending on the state that you're in, before somebody comes out and actually removes that tenant from the unit. So it's a lengthy process. And that's the other reason that I recommend getting in line as soon as possible. Don't wait. Send your 5 and send your 14. Do whatever you need to do as soon as you can do it, because you don't want to wait based on, I'm going to pay on Friday or whatever. I don't care if the tenant's going to pay on Friday. I'm going to start my process now. I can always stop a process, but I can't go back in time and start it in the past. So I'm going to start that process, get that ball rolling. And if the tenant brings their account current, great. That's what we always want to see happen. But if they don't get their account current, at least now you're, moving down the path towards that eviction. You're moving down the path towards getting your asset back under control. All right, we're going to jump into our next question. This one is from Russ. We have a rental where the owner has a no pets policy. Is an applicant required to disclose that they have a service animal or an emotional support animal? So I don't believe they're technically required to notify you right up until the time that they want to move that animal into the property. And we've had it happen several times where tenants will not list service animals on their application because we also run a no pets policy. We actually changed our application maybe about a year or so ago to change it from do you have any pets to do you have any animals? And we changed it specifically because we were trying to get people to say, yeah, I have an emotional support animal or I have a service animal or whatever the case may be. And I would say that it's probably 50-50 whether someone discloses it or not. At the end of the day, if someone has a service animal or an emotional support animal and it's legitimate, they have the paperwork and everything that they need, and you can verify the paperwork either yourself or through one of the multitude of screening companies out there that looks at ESA paperwork now, and there's a few of them out there. I can't name names, I don't think, but there are a couple of them if you do a search for screening for emotional support animals and stuff like that. There are some companies out there that do this type of thing now. So you do have some options there. And again, once they've got that service animal or that support animal, assuming everything is legitimate, and we all know how easy it is to get fake certificates, which is why you need to do your verifications, but assuming everything is legitimate, that's not a pet. And you need to understand that it's not a pet. It's a CPAP machine. It's a pair of crutches. It's no different than an oxygen tank at the end of the day. Once an animal has become a service animal or an emotional support animal, once they've got their paperwork, once they've been prescribed or whatever the case may be, assuming it's legitimate, assuming the doctor, this tenant is a patient of the doctor and everything turns up above board, it's no longer a pet. It's a piece of durable medical equipment. Again, the same as a pair of crutches or an oxygen tank would be. So we do have a video on the RentPrep YouTube page. It's a couple years old at this point, but I think most of the data in there is still valid. We had Jamie Kane, who's an attorney, landlord-tenant attorney, come in and talk to us about ESAs and service animals, how to go about screening them and things of that nature. You can find that over on our YouTube page. And then Ashley, I don't know if you're able, maybe you can post it in the chat comments as well. On to our next question from John. Who's responsible for paying hotel costs in the event that the premises is not habitable due to a sewer break? So this is one of my favorite type of questions. This one boils down to law, lease, and logic in order. What does your state law say in terms of who's responsible for a displaced tenant? Because pretty much every state's going to have laws with regards to this sort of a situation. In some states, it'll give you a time frame, such as if the tenant needs to be displaced for more than X number of days, it's on the landlord to take care of their accommodation or something like that. Or it could even be, after X number of days, if the landlord is not able to get the home back into a habitable situation, the tenant is authorized to break the lease with no penalty or whatever the case may be. So first and foremost, you're going to want to take a look at your state law and see what your state law says. That's going to be the overriding rule no matter where you are. Now, assuming your state law doesn't have good definitions of what's going on or what is required, you would go down to your lease. And in our lease, it basically states that in the event that the home is made uninhabitable through no fault of the landlord, so like the tenant causes a sewer backup, for instance, and the home is uninhabitable because the tenant backed up the sewer. Not only is the tenant responsible for that repair, we're certainly not taking care of their hotel costs because it was a tenant-caused issue. Now, by the same token, if the sewer backed up because there were roots that had intruded into the sewer line, it's cracked out by the street, there's some roots that had gotten into it or a situation like that, and the backup was as a result of us not either repairing that line or having the roots cut out of the line, whatever the case may be, that one would fall back to the landlord, in my opinion. And that boils back to warranty of habitability. If you're not taking care of the property, and as a result of you not taking care of the property, roots were permitted to grow into a sewer line, and as a result of the roots, there was a backup into the basement, that's on you, man. That's on you as the landlord for not taking care of the property. And I would say at that point that you should probably be looking at either prorating the rent or something along those lines. But that's how I would handle a situation like that. It really does boil down to what does the law say, what does your lease say, and then what does logic dictate, kind of in that order. Not even kind of, definitely in that order. If you can't figure it out in the law, you need to refer to your lease. If you don't have it in your lease, then you need to look at what's the most logical solution here. If you're still not sure, you can always hop on the group, the Facebook group, Rent Prep for Landlords, and ask on there, and you're probably going to get some answers that say, yeah, you should be covering this. And you probably are going to get some answers that say, no, this is a tenant responsible item. And that's where the logic thing comes in, because that's where it really boils down to how you look at your business and how you run your business. So for about 90% of everything that you're going to encounter, there's going to be something either in the law or in your lease that's going to stipulate how it's handled. For that remaining 5 to 10%, there's logic. On to our next question. This one is from Mohammed. What is the best way to file for debt collection when tenants move out without informing you? What website or company is the best to file against tenants for collection? So I can't make any sort of a recommendation as to websites that deal with tenant collections, but I can tell you that there are several companies out there that will chase a tenant. They'll take the collection account and they'll chase bad rent debts and things like that. There are some companies out there specifically geared toward landlord collection accounts. That said, I've always had very, very limited success with collections in most instances. And I also don't think that it's worth taking a tenant to small claims court to get a judgment against them for whatever they owe you, because you're going to spend more money on getting the small claims judgment. And yeah, at least here in the state of New York, they're good for 10 years, but are you ever actually going to get paid, or are you just going to have a piece of paper that says that somebody owes you a pile of money? I've got lots of pieces of paper. I really don't need another one that says that someone owes me money, especially if I know that that tenant is never, ever, ever going to pay me. We have sent some of our cases to small claims, but we basically look at the tenant as a whole. We'll do another credit and background check, which we're authorized to do in both our lease and our rental application. Allows us to do credit checks even after the termination of tenancy if it's for collection purposes. You can also send to a skip tracing company. There's other ways to get information as to where a tenant went. But if we think that a tenant has assets or will eventually be in a position where they're looking to purchase a home or something of that nature, that's probably a tenant that's worth considering sending to the small claims court and getting the judgment. But if it's a tenant that really doesn't have a whole lot going on in their life and things are just kind of falling apart, and it was a situation where they basically left because they could no longer afford the apartment, what do you really what's the benefit? What are you really getting by getting that piece of paper saying that you have money that's owed by that? You're never going to get the money. You're never going to get the money. It's not worth pursuing it in court in most instances. And if you speak to an honest attorney, like a legitimate, honest landlord-tenant attorney, I think they'll tell you the same thing. I just had the same conversation with an attorney this past weekend, and he basically said the exact same thing that I just said. If you're in a situation where a tenant moves out and they owe you a pile of money, the chances of you ever recovering that money, very, 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 very slim. Chasing them in small claims court probably isn't going to do you a whole lot of good. It's just going to put you through some additional expense. And at the end of the day, do you really want to spend good money chasing bad money? So I think we've touched on that one about as much as we can. I would definitely say, if you're going to do something, send it to collections. I think the collections is probably a little bit better route to go, because at least then you're not spending a bunch of money. Most collections agencies take that stuff on contingency, such that whatever they collect, they're going to take a third or a half or whatever, and they're going to give you the rest of it. That's probably a better scenario, because then at the end of the day, if the tenant never pays anything, you're not really out anything either. But that would probably be the route that I would go. Small claims is definitely not worth it in about 95% of instances. On to our next question. This one is from Elizabeth, and this we're now starting to jump into the questions that we pulled from our Facebook page. So some of these were questions that were submitted, and others were pulled right out of our Facebook group, and we'll go ahead and answer some of these as well. From Elizabeth, does anyone know if you can require a fixed term lease? If it's an existing tenant and their current fixed term is ending, can you start eviction if they choose not to sign the new lease? That's going to depend on what state you're in. Different states have different rules with regards to tenancies and what you can require and what you can't require. Here in the state of New York, I know that by default, when a tenancy is at the end of its first term, it automatically rolls to a month-to-month tenancy. Our lease stipulates that that does not take place, that the lease automatically renews with a 5% rent increase. I think it's a 5% rent increase for another 1-year term. So our lease kind of has a backup plan built right into it. Typically speaking, we try not to rely on that. We would rather put a new lease in place prior to the end of a lease term. But in an instance like what you're dealing with, where it sounds like the tenant's essentially just refusing to sign a new lease and wants to roll to month, if you're not in a state that requires you, let me rephrase that. If you're in a state that requires you to keep a tenant in a unit until the tenant decides that they want to go, like you can't just terminate a tenancy, you're probably going to wind up stuck with that tenant on a month-to-month term. If you're in a state that does allow you to terminate a tenancy at the end of a lease term, my recommendation would be issue notice and terminate the tenancy. If the tenant really wants to stay that badly, if they really love their home that much, they're probably going to be willing to start talking to you at that point about lease terms. Maybe they don't want a 1 year because they might have to move in 6 months for work or something like that. Maybe you can negotiate different lease terms. If you're going to negotiate shorter term, maybe you can bump the rent up a little bit to offset your risk or whatever the case may be. But yeah, that would be my recommendation. If you're in a state that allows you to issue a termination notice, issue the termination notice. And that's what we do in our office. If we're getting to a point where someone's not communicating with us and we're coming up on the end of their lease term, rather than let it go month to month, we will issue them the termination notice, and then they can come back to us and renegotiate the lease terms after they've received that notice. Next question from Lucy. Any downsides to giving 2 months notice on a month-to-month lease? Legally in Minnesota, we only need to give notice 1 day before the next rental period. So 1 month notice, so 30-day notice. I'm assuming this is for a termination of tenancy. So here in the state of New York, we actually have to give more notice if we're terminating a tenancy, and it's based on the length that the tenant has lived there. So if they've lived there for 1 year or less, we do have to give the same 30-day notice that you need to give in Minnesota. In the event that the tenant has lived there for 1 to 2 years, or they have a 2-year tenancy, then you have to give them 60 days notice. And then if they've lived there for more than 2 years, you have to give them a 90-day notice. From where I'm sitting, I don't have a problem with that. Generally speaking, at the beginning, it created a little bit of a headache in our business because we needed to adjust our policy and when we start approaching tenants, asking if they're going to renew their leases and things of that nature. And it did change our policy. We now start looking at 120 days, the 120-day mark. Are you staying or are you going? This is what your rent's going to be for the next term. Because assuming that tenant's been there for longer than 2 years, we only have a 30-day period to find out whether or not they're staying or going before we need to issue that termination notice to have it be effective on the last day of their lease term. So again, at 120 days, you've got 30 days plus your 90 days notice if that tenant's 2 years, which is why we use that time frame. If you have a tenant that hasn't been there quite as long, obviously you don't have quite as much of a time frame that you need to deal with. That said, we've gotten to the point where we just give all of our tenants that same courtesy. They're all getting that 120 days. We're looking 1 quarter ahead at what's happening in our leasing cycle to know whether or not we're going to have things popping up or not. This is also, as you start to grow and have more units, this is also nice because it lets you know, okay, I need to start planning for the fact that Lucy's not going to stay in this apartment 4 months down the road. I'm going to have a vacancy. I'm going to start planning for rehab or whatever the case may be. So it can actually give you a little bit more insight into your business by giving the tenant more of a time frame. And then the one thing I would say is if the tenant's still trying to decide on what they're doing, when they get to that time frame by which you need to make your decision, issue the notice. So what I mean here is if a tenant is trying to decide they're a 2-year tenant, which means they're entitled to 60 days notice, you have to give minimum 60 days to terminate the lease. You contact them at 120 days, you contact them at 90 days, I don't know, still trying to figure it out. You can issue that termination notice prior to the 60-day, and you can still negotiate those lease terms with that tenant right up until the day that the lease ends. But it gives you the knowledge that that tenant has to be out at the end of their lease term if they don't sign a new lease with you or come to terms with you. And if they haven't signed a new lease with you, now you can move forward and proceed with your eviction, assuming you're in a state that allows for that. I hope I covered everything in that. There was quite a bit of information in that little question there. Next question from John. When raising rent with proper notice on a month-to-month tenant, Is it best to do a new lease or an amendment to the current lease? I personally like to use a new lease. So we actually have our lease updated on a yearly basis. We send our lease to an attorney on a yearly basis for a top to bottom review. Every word of every single page, look at my lease language, make sure that I'm still compliant with what the laws here are in the state of New York, make sure that I didn't miss anything, kind of going back to one of our previous questions. I don't catch every change in legislation. Make sure that I didn't miss any changes in legislation over the course of the previous year, things of that nature. So I prefer to put tenants on a new lease every single year, even if they are, I prefer to put tenants on a new lease every single year versus an amendment, because every single year there's going to be one or two changes in our original lease, and I would rather have a tenant on the most current format of whatever our lease happens to be. And then whenever we generate a new lease, we actually put a version number on the bottom of it, so I can tell at a glance, okay, at the bottom of this page, this tenant is on version 1 of this lease. We're currently on version 3 of our lease. This tenant needs to have a new lease generated the next time they come up for renewal. Like, it really helps you to kind of keep track and make note as to what's going on. The other thing I do is we have a revisions document for our lease that lists between the different versions any changes that we made. And we do that because sometimes you need to go back and look at the past and see, hey, how did we handle this previously, or whatever the case may be. So that would be my recommendation. Save different versions of your lease every time you make edits of it so that you have those old revisions, and keep a revision document so you know what you edited from one version to the next and why. All right, next question from Tariq. Have you evaluated options to install security systems and exterior cameras to remotely monitor properties when vacant and make it optionally accessible to tenants for their peace of mind? If so, which systems did you choose? I don't have any buildings that have tenant accessible security systems or exterior cameras or anything of that nature. I'm not sure if that opens you up to some sort of a liability or not by giving tenants access to it. That'd be a question for an attorney. But no, we don't have anything where we do tenant monitored or tenant access security or exterior cameras or anything of that nature, just simply because it's not something that we've had to get into, fortunately for us. That said, we do have some buildings where we have cameras that we can access, usually on the exterior of buildings or facing parking lots or something of that nature. I've got better things to do than sit and watch security cameras all day, so really they're just there to record in case something happens. Every once in a while it'll pop up and something will be of use, either for us or for a neighboring, property owner or something of that nature. So, it makes sense to have some cameras possibly on the exterior of your property. Now, I guess I should probably divert here and say that every state does have its own rules and regulations with regards to where you can record, what you can record in terms of audio and video and things of that nature, what disclosures you need to make, etc. So make sure that you're following whatever the laws are in your state with regards to where you can place cameras, what they can legally record, and things of that nature. Now, going back to the root of the question here, what systems did we choose? We have a couple different systems in place. On the office, I have a Ring doorbell, which is convenient because there's not always somebody available at the front desk. Somebody can hit the doorbell and get a live human being. If they want to tell us they're putting something in the Dropbox or whatever, great. Now we have a video record of it. Thank you for letting us know. Those seem to work really, really well. You do have to have a Wi-Fi connection, obviously. But we really enjoy the Ring camera for that reason. We've used Ring cameras, like the doorbell camera specifically, on some of our rental properties. But anytime you have a situation like that where you have a camera or something along those lines, you need to have Wi-Fi on the property, or you need to have some sort of a cellular modem or a cellular hotspot or something like that, such that your cameras can connect to that and then connect out to the internet. Now you're talking about data usage and bandwidth caps and blah, 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 blah. I don't have a good solution here is essentially what I'm telling you. Other systems that we've tried, I currently have Arlo, ARLO, on my personal residence. Have three outdoor cameras and a doorbell camera. We're really liking that. The notification system is really, really good. I've never missed a notification, at least not that I'm aware of. I guess you wouldn't know if you'd missed any notifications. But we were using a different set of cameras prior to that. I'll go ahead and call it out. I'm going to say it was Yi Home, YI Home was the name of the camera system, and they were awful. The push notifications were really, really bad. I would not recommend that camera system until they get their app fixed a little bit, because if you're trying to see when someone is coming and going from a property and the notifications aren't coming through, the notifications weren't coming through, we ultimately found out because the motion sensors weren't detecting the motion. So that would be one set of cameras that I would recommend against, would be Yi. And I could strongly recommend Arlo, and I could strongly recommend Ring. We don't have affiliate relationships with any of those companies. You know, do what you will, but those would be the companies that I have personal experience with, and that's just me kind of sharing my personal experience with those 3 brands. On to our next question from, I'm going to say Angelus. What should you do when a lease has been sent out for signature but it is not being returned? Just ignore it and move on? Am I supposed to officially withdraw the offer to sign the lease to avoid any confusion in the future? How long should I keep waiting? Thank you. So I'm taking it that you're basically offering a lease out for signature. This is a tenant that you've offered an apartment to. You're looking for them to sign their first lease and move into the apartment. I remember this question. It was in the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group, and I commented on this in the group, but I'll go ahead and answer again here as well. And our process, basically what I did was I outlined what our process here is at Own Buffalo. Our lease process is pretty straightforward. We tell a tenant that once your application is approved, you have 5 business days to sign your lease and get us your security deposit in full. We send the lease to them digitally so they can sign it via email. Very straightforward. They have as much time as they need to take a look at the lease, ask any questions that they need to ask, clarify anything that they need to clarify, take it to their attorney, like we were talking about in an earlier question, and have it reviewed there. Whatever they feel like they need to take care of, they have plenty of time to do it within that 5-day period. And they also have to have their security deposit paid to us in certified funds also within that same 5-day period. We do tell tenants that we don't stop marketing an apartment until they've signed their lease and paid their security deposit in full. The reason for that is because we have literally had tenants just not show up for lease signings. We've had tenants not show up for move-ins. And at that point, you're back on the hunt for a new tenant, and you've lost all that marketing time waiting for this tenant. So we've stopped that process. We tell tenants the apartment is still available until you've signed your lease and you've paid your security deposit in full. That's what locks in the apartment. Nothing until that point will lock in the apartment. Now, in some states, you can't do that. In some states, you do have to accept the first application that meets your qualifications. And in that instance, you're going to have to check the state laws in that state to really figure out what the ins and outs are. But I would say maybe shorten the amount of time that you give your tenant to sign a lease and get you the deposit, such that they aren't taking you off market for an extended period of time while you're losing potential, other potential tenants, waiting for this tenant that may or may not sign off on that lease. So check your state law, find out what you need to do there. But from where I'm sitting, 5 days is more than enough time for you to get me a deposit and for you to sign that lease. And if you need more time, I need to know why. Like, I can't get in to see my attorney until next week. All right, I can give you a little bit more time, or whatever the case may be. So that's how I would handle it. That's how we handle it here in our office. And that seems to work very, very well for us. On to the next question from Kara. Hello, bottom line, renters are asking that we pay for repainting, materials, and labor in the inside of our property for them with their chosen colors. For some background, they have been renting since the summer of 2018. We painted the inside before they moved in 4 years ago. They're good renters for the most part, except for they routinely are late to pay rent, usually 5 to 10 days, always with an excuse of other expenses that pop up. Since they've been renting, we have replaced several appliances, fridge, garbage disposal, stove, etc., replaced windows and sliding glass door, and are planning to replace the deck and install some recessed lighting that they requested. Is it common or expected that landlords pay for interior painting every few... Kara, I'm going to be a little bit blunt here. Whose house is this? Yours or the tenant's? Like, the only time we replace appliances in the middle of a tenancy is if the appliance breaks and we can't get it repaired. Same thing with, garbage disposal. If it breaks, yeah, we'll probably replace it. But more often than not, we just get rid of garbage disposals because we find that they break and clog and create more of a headache. So if it's an opportunity for us to remove a garbage disposal and the tenant doesn't care, we're getting rid of it. As far as the fridge, the stove, things like that go, unless there's something wrong with those appliances that the fridge isn't keeping food cold or the stove isn't getting food hot, no reason to replace appliances in the middle of a tenancy. Replaced windows and sliding glass door. Again, I don't know if those are tenant requested repairs or if this is something that you did because you wanted to do it. Install some recessed lighting that they requested. That's the thing that has me kind of leaning against you on this one. And they rented the property knowing the condition of the property. There was not recessed lighting when they moved in, and they shouldn't expect you to come in and change light fixtures over to recessed lighting because they requested it. It is not common or expected for landlords to pay for the interior painting of a property once every few years. And honestly, I think you're going way above and beyond as a landlord here when it comes to this tenancy. I think you've kind of created your own monster here, unfortunately, and I hope that you're able to find a way back out of it. But there's no way that you would catch us going in and just changing appliances on a whim or painting every few years because a tenant's requesting it or something like that. That said, we have had tenants that have lived in units for 10 and 15 years and requested flooring updates because the flooring has literally worn through or something like that. That's a totally different scenario. Making an interior color change 4 years into a tenancy? Absolutely not. Good luck. I think you're going to need it on that one. Question from Edward. Hello, fellow landlords. I have a situation and I was looking for some feedback. I've owned a triplex close to my parents for 5 years where I rented an upper unit to an elderly gentleman. The upper units must walk down exterior steps to get to their apartment. I bought the home for my parents and the elderly man is a close friend of my father. I charge him very little rent. My concern is I am noticing that he's struggling to get up and down the stairs. I am concerned that this is going to lead to a liability issue at some point. The home is up north and is susceptible to bad weather. The steps were completely updated, but they aren't covered. I don't want him to move, but I am concerned about him falling in the future. Any thoughts? So do what you need to do to protect yourself and protect your asset as a landlord. Make sure that you have good, strong railings. Make sure that they're not wobbly. Maybe if you want to go a little bit further, make sure that you have some sort of protection that would prevent somebody from falling, like slipping on the stairs and then rolling off and then falling from height down to the ground or something like that. I'm envisioning a set of stairs that kind of ramps up to the back of a house here, an exposed set of stairs. Now, in our leases, tenants are responsible for their own snow maintenance, which would mean that in this instance, this elderly gentleman would be responsible for making sure that his steps are cleared of snow and ice and throwing rock salt and things of that nature. Sometimes you get to a point where it's no longer a good match for a tenant and a unit, and you may be in a situation just like that here. That said, you could very easily find yourself being accused of discrimination if you tell this tenant, you have to move because I'm afraid you're going to fall down the stairs. So my recommendation would be contact an attorney and talk to them about this situation. Ask them what options you have in this scenario. And have a conversation with the tenant. It doesn't have to be antagonistic or anything like that. You can literally say to the guy, hey, I'm concerned about you being able to get up and down the stairs. Is this apartment still meeting your needs? Is it time for you to start looking for something that's, that fits your needs better or whatever the case may be? This is a tough situation. I don't envy you at all. I would recommend having a conversation with somebody that really understands what you can and can't do legally in your state with regards to terminating tenancies and things of that nature. Other options, if you didn't want to terminate the tenancy, you could. We've got a couple options. I just happened to think of another one, but we'll get to it. You could have the lawn and snow taken care of on behalf of the tenants and just add it into the rent. Obviously, with you charging little rent, it doesn't sound like that's an option that you're going to want to be involved in. But realistically speaking, by taking care of the steps and things of that nature, you are taking some more liability on yourself, but it might make it a little bit easier, especially if the elderly gentleman's not able to care for the steps. It might make it a little bit easier for him to get up and down if he's not the one responsible for taking care of the snow conditions. If you really wanted to spend some money, and I'm not recommending this, if you really wanted to spend some money, you could certainly go forward and put a chairlift in. Or put a hydraulic elevator in. Again, I'm not doing it. If it was my property, that's not something that I'm looking at doing because you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars for either one of those scenarios. But hey, it's an option. So it's something that I will mention. I think we're going to jump into our last question of the day here. This one is from Mario. How can I handle a tenant situation such as this? I messaged her that she needs to find a place to move to. She needs to move out because I need the house back. We don't have a lease contract anymore because it's month to month. I'm tired of her always paying almost a month delayed, and before paying, she always messages me looking for some sort of imperfections and wanting me to fix this and that, something that's not really a problem. Essentially, it looks like she doesn't want to move out. So if you've had a conversation with the tenant and they've said, and you've told them, hey, we need you to move out, more likely than not, you're going to have to issue some sort of a notice on paper, and there's going to be a process in your state for that situation. I would recommend that you get in touch with a landlord-tenant attorney and find out what the proper situation or proper procedure is for your state and follow that procedure. Just telling someone, hey, you got to go. I don't know of any state where a verbal notice that you need to move out will hold up in court. And even if you did get to court on some sort of a verbal notice, good luck defending it. It's obviously going to be one party versus the other. And I honestly think in an instance like that, the tenant's probably going to win. Contact a landlord-tenant attorney, figure out what you need to do, what the procedure is in your state for terminating a tenancy the correct way, and go about doing this the right way. Because I think that the way that you're going right now, you haven't done anything wrong yet, but you haven't done anything right yet either. And I think that there's still time for you to straighten this one out before it gets to the point where it's out of your control. That's pretty much going to wrap things up for this month's episode of this month's Ask Me Anything session. We do run these Ask Me Anything sessions about once a month now. If for any reason you are looking to find one of these, you can find them on our Facebook page. You can also find them on our YouTube page after they're posted, or after they occur rather. We do post them on our Facebook page and to our YouTube page as well. And then we obviously run these once a month. So if you are a member of the Facebook group, facebook.com/group/RentPrep, you'll be one of the first ones to know because we do post these in the Facebook group first. And there's always going to be a link where you can submit your own questions. Your question may be picked up in an upcoming episode, might even be put into the podcast or something of that nature. So definitely feel free to fill out that form, bring us your questions. We look forward to answering them every single month here in these AMA sessions. All that being said, thank you so much for watching. We truly do appreciate it. If this was of benefit to you, do us a favor, give us a like. We really appreciate that. If you know someone that this would benefit, do us a favor and share it with them. That really helps to spread the message. And it also helps us to help other landlords. So thank you for that. We truly do appreciate it. For Ashley and everyone else at the RentPrep offices, and for myself, Andrew, here in my office, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next month.